Listen to a conversation between a student and an employee in the Student Activities Office.
Hi, is this where I find out about school trips?
Yep, sure is. How can I help you?
Well, I'm looking for information about a ski trip.
Oh, yeah, we just scheduled one for next month. We haven't even had time to advertise it yet, so you'll be the first to sign up.
Well, actually, I wanted to know about an old ski trip from about 7 years ago. My brother went on it, and he still talks about the wonderful hotel. I think it was a ski lodge that they stayed at.
Oh, which one?
Well, that's the thing. He can't remember. My family, we're thinking about planning a family ski vacation over winter break, and we'd like to go there, but...
I wasn't working here then, and we don't keep records for older trips, but you could check with the newspaper office. They probably advertised or wrote about the trip when it happened.
Okay, thanks for the idea. But did you say you have a ski trip planned? Maybe it's to the same hotel.
Probably not. We'll be going to the new mountain lodge up at Snowy Mountain. It was just built last year. Maybe you should come. I think you'd really like it. The ski slopes are right outside the front door.
Well, the truth is I'm not much of a skier, but the place my brother went to, they have a fireplace, an ice skating rink, a game room, basically lots of stuff for people who don't ski.
Oh, well, Mountain Lodge has all that and more. There's live music, dancing. Oh, and they have a really great dining room. At least it's gotten really good reviews. The food is supposed to be excellent.
So it might be worth it just to get away from our cafeteria food for a couple of days.
True. And it's all inclusive. Students pay one price and then the skiing, ice skating, food, whatever, it's all included, even equipment and lessons.
It sounds great. Do you have a brochure or something I can look over?
Not yet. We just scheduled the trip yesterday, but, the trip planning committee is always looking for new members. They're meeting tomorrow night to discuss the details of this trip. Maybe you should come. You could give input about scheduling a ski trip that would attract non-skiers as well. Maybe suggest some alternate activities.
Well, if I have the time.
If enough people sign up for the trip, the lodge will give us a discount, so your input could be really valuable.
Huh. Sounds like fun. Maybe I will. But for now, I think I'll head over to the newspaper office. Thanks for your help.
Why does the student go to the Student Activities Office? Why does the man suggest that the student visit the school newspaper office? How does the man try to convince the student to go on the upcoming school ski trip? Why does the man think that the student could contribute to the trip planning committee? Why does the student say this?
But the place my brother went to, they have a fireplace, an ice skating rink, a game room.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
I'd like to talk to you today about a principle of evolutionary biology that was first proposed in the 19th century by an American scientist named Edward Cope. Cope made a scientific examination of fossils and thought he noticed a pattern of increasing sizes within species. And he proposed a principle, which is usually called Cope's rule. What Cope said was that evolution was directed towards larger-sized creatures, and that this can be seen in many, perhaps even in most, fossil lineages. Fossil lineages, we talked about that before. They're chronological charts of fossils of a specific species, charted over time. These lineages allowed Cope to compare fossils of different ages, some millions of years older than others. And Cope notes a tendency toward increasing size. Now, there are some obvious advantages to being bigger, even within the same species. Like, being bigger can be a deterrent to predators. So, you're less likely to be eaten, more likely to survive if you happen to be bigger. In certain species, bigger animals are more fuel efficient. They need less food per pound to keep themselves going. Although, of course, they need more food overall because they're bigger. It's the same thing with marine animals. In order to maintain body heat, larger whales need less food per pound than smaller whales. Also, in most species, larger females tend to produce more eggs, increasing their chances of passing on their genes. Okay, so these are all good reasons why there might be an evolutionary advantage towards larger size. And Cope's rule was not really questioned much. It just seemed obvious that such a thing had to be true. And fossil lineages seemed to confirm it. However, in the 1970s and 80s, there was a pretty serious challenge to Cope's rule, mounted primarily by the famous scientist Stephen Jay Gould, who promoted an alternative theory, which subsequently gained widespread acceptance by biologists. Gould thought of evolution as a much more random process than many previous scientists thought. He was very much set against theories suggesting that evolution tends to drive in a certain direction, tends to direct towards certain ends. Gould felt that such theories, like Cope's rule, are influenced more by the psychology of the scientist. You know, what's on that scientist's mind, than the actual science and facts regarding the subject. People assumed that bigger had to be better, and so they tended to look at these fossils that way, the way Cope did. But you know, there's a very strong danger of ignoring the evidence that's contrary to your thesis, and often we don't even realize we're doing it. Gould was troubled because Cope did things like he compared the sizes of fossils with others that might be 10 million years older. Gould felt that it could be a misleading comparison. And also, the fossil record is not complete. There are all kinds of gaps, and you can interpret the gaps in different ways. Gould, for these reasons, he believed that Cope's rule might have been not a rule at all, just a human invention. Cope found what he needed in order to support his theory, but he didn't really prove it. And Gould suggested another rather interesting possibility. He claimed, and there's a certain amount of foundation to this, that when a natural disaster wipes out large numbers of individuals in a species, they often tend to wipe out the bigger individuals more quickly. Let's say it gets really cold and your food supply is cut off. Well, the smaller creatures, which don't need as much food as the larger creatures, smaller creatures may find it easier to survive. So what Gould suggested is that after a natural disaster, evolution, which is random, might not look random. It might look directed. Because, in effect, there's nowhere to go but up when only the smallest of a species survive. Animals were going to have to get bigger after a disaster, no matter what. So that growing bigger is merely a tendency, not an evolutionary advantage. It's not evolution directing towards larger sizes. Now, there have been other challenges to Cope's rule, like, why then are there still so many small animals on Earth? Well, one reason is simple physics. You won't see an insect as large as an elephant because the insect's exoskeleton simply can't support the weight.
What is the main purpose of the lecture? What principle does Cope's rule try to promote? Why does the professor list some advantages that larger animals have over smaller ones? According to Gould, what tends to occur after natural disasters? What point does the professor make when she mentions that an insect cannot be the size of an elephant? Why does the professor say this?
But you know, there's a very strong danger of ignoring the evidence that's contrary to your thesis, and often we don't even realize we're doing it.
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
I want to return to a discussion we just started last time about how painters are able to show details in any kind of light, from near total darkness to very bright sunlight. It's easy to take this ability for granted, but if you've ever tried painting, you know this is a real challenge. Painters are trying to do something that the human eye does much more efficiently. Scientists have a term for our ability to see details in all kinds of light. They call it our perceptual dynamic range. Dynamic range is expressed as a ratio. It's the number of different, distinct levels that our eyes are able to perceive between the extremes of dark and light. Now, in our everyday world, it's normal for that range to exceed 50,000 to 1. But when an artist tries to recreate that range using paint and canvas, well, those materials aren't capable of producing a range of more than about 300 to 1. Susan?
But that El Greco painting we were looking at last time, that seemed to have a lot of, it had shadows and sunlight. The range looked pretty wide to me.
That's because El Greco used some painting tricks to make you think you were seeing a greater dynamic range. Remember, the very intense colors he used, they were strong, but they were also opposites, like the red and the blue clothing on the people. Those contrasting colors made certain details seem much clearer. Do you remember anything else about that painting?
Well, there were those white lines he used to outline some different parts of the background. That made those trees really stand out in the dark forest.
Right. Artists often use heavy white or black lines around the edges of a detail to make it pop out. In fact, let's look, yes, David.
Sorry, but I was just wondering about photography. I'm guessing that photographs can show a greater range, a greater dynamic range than paintings, right?
I'm glad you asked that. I borrowed some pictures from Dr. Henson's photography class to show you. But first, to answer your question, surprisingly, the dynamic range in a lot of traditional photography isn't much greater because of the film and paper that's used. So photographers develop techniques to make details stand out, just like painters have. Take Ansel Adams. I know you've all seen his photographs. Well, he developed a system in 1941. He called it the zone system. Imagine a scale from pure black to pure white. Adams divided that scale, the whole range of light intensities, into 10 equal zones. And this scale with its 10 zones is like a visual ruler that photographers can use to measure tonal ranges in a consistent way. And because of its consistency, Adams' system was widely adopted and used until the 1980s. Of course, how photographers used it is a little complicated. I think I'll leave that explanation for Dr. Henson's class.
Does the system only work for black and white film?
No. Adams used black and white, but the system works just fine with color. Here's something else that may surprise you, though. You'd think that adding color would help make details clearer in a picture, but it's just the opposite. You really lose a lot of details at both the dark and light ends of the range. Or at least that was true until HDR photography came along. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. High means that there's a greater level of detail visible over the whole range. With HDR, photographers are taking advantage of the capabilities of digital cameras and computer software to overcome some of the inherent limitations of traditional equipment. Let's take a look at one example. Here, you've got 3 pictures, all of the same scene. That first picture, up there on the left, is dark, underexposed. You can see details in the snow pretty well, and the clouds in the sky, but there's not enough light to see much of anything in the darker areas. The second picture is a medium exposure, which captures the middle tones, and the third picture is overexposed. The camera lets in so much light that you can see some details in the shadowy areas, but the snow, the sky, they're pretty much washed out. What if you combine the photos, though, used computer HDR software to blend details from all of the photos into one picture, like this?
Whoa, that's really neat.
Yeah, if only I could have been using that technique. To think of all the photographs I've taken that might have ended up on the wall, instead of in the trash can.
What is the main purpose of the lecture? What are 2 techniques the professor mentions that painters use to increase the illusion of dynamic range in their works? Why does the professor discuss Ansel Adams? What does the professor imply about traditional color photography? In HDR photography, what is one reason for taking several photographs of the same scene? What does the student imply about HDR photography when she says this?
To think of all the photographs I've taken that might have ended up on the wall, instead of in the trash can.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor, I know you're swamped with grading finals.
Yeah, I am.
But thanks for making the time today.
No problem. So, what can I help you with?
Well, actually, something's been on my mind lately, and I'm a little worried.
Really? Your final paper was great.
Oh, that's a relief. Actually, that's not it. The thing is, I'm not so sure about what I should do after college.
Well, this is certainly not the first time I've heard that one. Mostly from students whose major areas of study are directed toward humanities. And I'm sure the same goes for many of my colleagues in the humanities as well.
Yeah, well, I'm starting my last semester, and when I think about graduating, I get a little nervous. I mean, I've always known, kind of in the back of my mind, that it's tough to get a job right out of college with a concentration in English. I mean, now I just don't see how something like an engaging discussion of 18th century literature will let me put much on any job application.
Do you have any special interests other than literature?
Well, I love to write, and computers. They're not just a hobby for me. I really like learning about them. In fact, my friends say I've got a real knack for them.
Okay, so what about... Have you ever considered technical writing as a career? You have to be a very effective written communicator to write about how to use computer software and hardware, and you are an excellent writer. Look, I'm not saying that you should pursue a career as a technical writer. I just want you to realize that it's not the specific subject matter you've learned that's the key here. Think about what your interests are and the skills you've picked up, like the ability to write critically and to read a text and think critically about it. Just think of your education in terms of skills and knowledge.
That all makes sense.
And then, of course, there's graduate school.
Yeah, I've considered it.
If you went on to graduate school and earned your PhD and became a professor, you'd never have to stop talking about 18th century literature. You'd even get paid for it.
I don't know, though. I feel like that's what I should do, but my heart's really not in it. At least not now.
That's fine. In fact, I know several graduate students who came in straight from their undergraduate studies who maybe should have thought about their choices a bit more carefully before registering. But anyway, yeah, a lot of people don't go to graduate school right after undergrad. Many need that break. It's normal. But that, of course, doesn't rule out grad school for good. But then I would suggest you think about some careers that might interest you, write some of them down, and we'll talk about it next week. See what might be a good fit, how you'd approach trying to find a job in those areas.
Sounds great.
Why does the man go to see the professor? What does the professor imply about students who major in the humanities? Why does the professor mention technical writing? What is the professor's opinion about students who immediately begin graduate school after finishing college? What does the professor advise the man to do next? Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
Okay, moving on. Let me ask an open question. Have any of you ever seen an aurora? Maybe you've heard it called by its other name, the Northern Lights? Carolyn.
Yeah, when I was little. It's the lights in the sky, right? I was in Alaska on vacation.
Okay, good. It's in the very high latitudes, places like Alaska, which is near the North Pole of Earth, or areas near the South Pole, where you'd be able to see an aurora best. So what did you think?
Oh, I don't remember that well. I think it was like just this big stripe of light in the sky. Sort of, like a big greenish band type thing.
A band, huh? Sort of like this?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Yeah, it looks like a band or a curtain, and the greenish color is quite common. But you see other shapes and colors too, for example, arcs, or a red color. And you'd be able to see them when the sky's clear and dark. And like I said, you need to be in higher latitudes. Matt?
I have to say, this is the first I've ever heard of something like this. Is it caused by, like, light pollution? Like, too much light shining up from some human source or something?
Like I said, you need a dark and clear sky to experience this. And light pollution, well, why don't we take a closer look at these auroras?
All right.
Let's start with solar activity. and its interactions with Earth's magnetic field. See, the sun, as you know, on the sun you have constant activity, like explosions, and plasma, the sun's matter, just sort of seething all the time. The explosions from the sun, they blow tons of super hot, electrically charged particles out into space. These particles break off from the sun and blow away in all directions. This movement of charged particles is called solar wind.
I see. So you're saying the solar wind's the cause, but then, if the solar wind is blowing from the sun every which way, how come you can only see an aurora in polar regions or near polar regions?
Think of Earth as one big giant magnet. So Earth is surrounded by a magnetic field, and we know that every magnet has a north and a south pole, and things get oriented toward those poles. Earth is no exception, right?
Right.
Okay, keep in mind that solar wind is electrically charged, which means that it interacts with the magnetic field, as electromagnetic theory tells us. Okay, how does it interact? Earth's magnetic field deflects most of the solar wind, makes it flow around Earth without getting very close. And that's actually quite important because these high-energy particles could be dangerous for living organisms like us if they ever reached Earth's surface. Some of the charged particles derived from solar wind, however, do get closer, but those are channeled by the magnetic field toward Earth's poles or polar regions. That's where they hit the upper atmosphere and create light, the aurora.
How do the particles create light?
Good. Let's talk about the atmosphere. It's mostly made up of nitrogen and oxygen, right? It's thickest closer to the Earth's surface, gets thinner as you go up. That's why it's easier to breathe at lower altitudes. And we get most of our weather in the lower atmosphere, in the first 10 miles or so of it. As for the aurora, its lowest edge is about 60 miles above Earth's surface and can go up hundreds of miles from there. Okay? So you have those charged solar wind particles hitting the upper atmosphere near the poles, right? These are high-energy electrons. And what happens is these electrons collide way up in the upper atmosphere with the molecules of the gases that are there. Matt?
You mean oxygen and nitrogen?
Yes, the gases that make up the atmosphere. So some of the energy from the charged electrons gets transferred to oxygen and nitrogen molecules, which causes the molecules to get into an excited state, which is a technical term for molecules with extra energy. But these molecules hold on to that energy just briefly and then let it go. And the energy they let go comes out as light. So when this happens to a lot of molecules at once, they can produce enough light that it's visible to people.
What is the purpose of the lecture? What does the professor say about the appearance of auroras? The professor describes how auroras form. Summarize the process by putting the steps in the correct order. According to the professor, how does Earth's magnetic field protect Earth's organisms? What does the professor imply about the relation between auroras and weather? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Is it caused by, light pollution? Like, too much light shining up from some human source or something?
Like I said, you need a dark and clear sky to experience this, and light pollution. Well, why don't we take a closer look at these auroras?
Why does the professor say this?
And light pollution. Well, why don't we take a closer look at these auroras?